Now we're live. This is the same guest I had before, Geolibertarian George. Bunch of
Hey, what's going on?
he's a economics major and currently getting his PhD. And I'm just some guy on the internet, like to talk to people. So you want to introduce yourself, dude?
Oh, well, I think that you pretty much covered it there. Um, yeah. So basically, I'm not a content creator. I'm essentially a Twitter troll. I I advocate for geolibertarianism and which is based on sort of the economic ideas of Georgism. Um, Blended with um, the philosophical ideals of libertarianism. Um, and yeah, aside from that, uh, as um, as Bastiat said here, I'm currently doing my PhD here in Germany in financial economics, um, which I'm my research is more in the area of financial mathematics, applied to derivatives valuation and uh, financial instruments trading.
So, our today's subject is classical liberalism. Maybe we're going to talk about economics and just what what did got you into classical liberalism or libertarianism anyway, George?
Well, um, I would say it was. I've been interested in politics since basically I was a teenager, and when I started first encountered libertarianism, it was something that really sort of, I guess, fundamentally rang true to me at the core, um, in terms of the um, the moral argumentation, in terms of sort of the ideals that a society should strive for. Uh, but I mean, I've always had sort of nuanced views, let's say. Um, and at that time, I was actually sort of a more of a Republican supporter. I'm ashamed to say that I supported George W. Bush at that time. Um, yeah, it was. I had a journey, but I still like. I would say, sort of at the core, had quite libertarian views on things. I was never really a social conservative. Um, in college, I moved much more in the direction of um, libertarianism in my views, sort of open libertarianism in my views, and I studied economics, so I got some exposure to different perspectives, um, sort of the classical liberal um, ideas in history of thought, but also sort of the more mainstream uh, analysis in economics, neoclassical synthesis, but also some exposure to game theory, um, limited exposure um, to behavioral economics as well. Um, and I would say that I sort of was always more of like, um, I mean, I was definitely a Ron Paul supporter when he ran at that time, but I would say that, over the course of sort of my interest in politics and my studies in economics, I've really developed over time into more of like, let's say, a center libertarian sort.
Um, Speaking of Ron Paul, do you still believe that we should, like abolish the Federal Reserve or at least reorganize it?
I'm definitely in favor of reform. Um, it's just I don't like the way that it's used in discretionary monetary policy uh, as a way of sort of, let's say, engineering credit markets and engineering interest rates, engineering market expectations. It's, I mean, it's ultimately a strategy that ends up backfiring. I think that a lot of Austrian analysis in this direction is quite correct. And on top of it, I mean, it's fundamentally set up. It's a quasi-private institution as well as all of the major banks are shareholders in the Federal Reserve. And it's created a system in which the banks are basically extracting rent from from uh, it's essentially controlling the money supply of the country in some way, uh, and having the power to, because they have the power to create money. Um,
So,
there's no way that we can really. I wouldn't say that we're in a position right now where we could abolish the central bank. Um, I don't think it would even be necessarily productive to do that. I think that it needs to be reformed in a way that, for example, I think that it should be taken into public ownership um, so that we don't get this situation where we are artificially engineering a banking system in which major banks are essentially given a position of market power. It should be a I would say it should be restricted to a role of being a lender of last resort. Because I mean, we've sort of engineered an economic system where there's definitely a possibility around over any horizon that we could be looking at a recession, and or that we could be looking at some sort of problem of liquidity in the financial markets, in particular in credit markets. So it's going to be very difficult to extract the Federal Reserve uh, from the system that has been built up. What I would like to see is, I mean, the biggest problem that I think needs to be addressed with the system of central banking is what ultimately ends up undermining the sort of attempts every once in a while when there's been some sort of recession or some sort of liquidity crunch to pump more liquidity into the market and stimulate demand. Is what ultimately ends up undermining this strategy is the effect on land rent. Given how much of the new credit supply ends up going into mortgage markets and real estate speculation. So ultimately, what we need to do is to sort of hamper or to sort of counteract that effect. I mean, this really goes hand in hand with my advocacy for Georgia's tax policy of moving away from the current tax system and going to a tax on land value that captures the full rental value of land, so that basically this will end up sort of disincentivizing the propagation of leveraged real estate speculation, leveraged land speculation, that ultimately ends up building these asset bubbles that end up popping. And perhaps whenever there's been some sort of intervention by a central bank, we end up seeing sort of the additional liquidity that comes into the market flowing more into productive demand. I would like to get to a point where the central bank is less active. Because I mean, the issue that we're having right now is because central banks have been intervening whenever there's been a business cycle downturn for decades. I mean, interest rates are absolutely in the floor right now. And I mean, this is something that has been disincentivizing productive investment for some time, because I mean, savers are not going to be getting a very high return on, you know, a loan portfolio for capital purchases of small to medium enterprises and so on and so forth. And I think that, I mean, I would like to get to a point where central banks really scale back on sort of pumping additional liquidity into the market. I would like to see a situation where we get to a much more sort of natural level of interest in the market that starts to incentivize people to save, in particular, sort of working class, middle class consumers who, for quite a few decades now, have been developing the habits of taking on consumer credit, and rather than saving. And I mean, it's just something that it's a really sort of fundamental basis I feel that we need to have for long-term sustained economic growth, as well as growth that's more evenly distributed as well.
Yeah.
Because I mean, the people who are really benefiting from the speculative bubbles that have been engineered into existence by, let's say, the broader monetary and fiscal regimes that have been that have been predominant in most of the developed economies. The people who have been really benefiting from this and have been gaining greater shares in wealth distribution are, I mean, it's quite a concentrated few who've been very good at timing speculation.
So, what's your well, how would you organize the current banking system? You said you want a lender of last resort. I know that Milton Friedman, the great monetarist economist, said that one of the reasons why he wanted to abolish the Fed or at least reorganize it is due to the fact it wasn't the lender of last resort during the Great Depression and had up end up creating the FDIC or is that it? I think to be the lender of last resort. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
just my view on banking is sort of like a really complicated history and economics that's currently beyond my understanding. From but what I'm understanding, it's just been rather distorting for for essential market information, from my understanding, due to the Fed um, due to the Fed policies it's implementing.
Yeah. Um, well, I mean, in the long run, I would like to get to a situation in which we have free banking. I'm theoretically, I'm quite a proponent of that. I mean, I still see I still see a role for government to issue a standard currency. I don't think that it should be a currency with, let's say, um, a monopoly on exchange within an economy for sure. But I still see value for some form of a fiat currency for purposes of tax collection.
So you don't you're skeptical of the gold standard then?
I wouldn't want the gold standard to be, let's say, the legal, um, let's say the monopoly legal tender, yeah, or a gold-backed currency to be the monopoly legal tender. I mean, there's some real problems um, with the gold standard, particularly as it relates to uh, a modern economy. Um, but I mean, as I said, I'm more of a proponent of free banking. So if in the market we end up with gold standard banks or something like that, then um, I believe Peter Schiff actually set one of these up somewhere in the Caribbean. Um, then I mean that's fine, but um, I mean I think that people should really have the freedom uh, to choose the medium of the exchanges that they make in the market. Like for example, I'm quite supportive of cryptocurrency.
Go Bitcoin.
Yeah. So, and I mean, it's definitely here to stay. I feel like we've gotten to a point where commerce has advanced, global commerce even has advanced to the point where, I mean, quite a lot of exchanges or global transactions are being made electronically, and it just makes a lot of sense to have uh, an electronic currency like this, in which people can make cross-border transactions without having to, pay the fees for foreign exchange transactions in the process.
So do you agree with Ron Paul takes on the U.S. dollar? Uh,
What's he saying these days? Is he still saying that it's going to crash at any point now?
I think he's saying it's getting weaker.
Um, well, I mean,
I haven't watched him in a while.
he's let's like I I'll always sort of admire Ron Paul. Um, but he's been telling this story for decades, and I mean there are definitely points in time in which he has correctly pointed out uh, the fall in the dollar. I think that he has been correct in the past, and I haven't watched his stuff in a long time, but I assume it continues to this day when he points out the sort of long-term dangers of the world moving away from a dollar reserve system uh, to the U.S. economy. I mean, that would really be a big blow. Um, but he's just. I feel like that he misses some things in his analysis, and I mean he's kind of fanatically attached to the idea that the U.S. financial system and economy is going to come down at any moment now. I mean, he sort of ignores some sort of facts on the ground in financial markets at times. Like, for example, after the popping of the credit bubble in 2007, 2008, I mean, at this time, he was also talking about the value of the dollar going down and how this was going to end up wrecking the economy and how it would continue going down. Well, what ended up happening was since the contagion ended up spreading to Europe, and then even more contagion developed in European financial markets with the sovereign debt crises. Uh, Basically, global investors ran to the US for a safe haven. Also, because interest rates in Europe, up to a sort of medium term point on yield curves, were negative. Um, Whereas in the US, at least, there was a couple of percent that could be earned on a 5 to 10 year bond for a number of years. So actually, that ended up having the impact of strengthening the US dollar at the time. Um, I.
You seem like you're frustrated with him, honestly.
Sorry?
You seem like you're frustrated with him when it comes to that.
No, not frustrated. I mean, I see, like, in the long run, I feel like that his analysis is, he's sort of on to the right point, but um, he definitely he misses some things for sure at
Um,
times. But I mean, that's okay. Um, the God, where were we?
right now in the live chat, my friend Pragmatic wants to know your opinion on negative interest rates.
Yeah. Well, not something that you really want to have for a long time.
Who?
Um,
Yeah, you're definitely right there.
yeah. I mean, it's for a number of years, and I've done some work um, in the asset management sector in Germany here. So I've been sort of in tune to what's been going on in the market here for some time. Um, I mean, there's been a big bubble in sovereign bonds in the major financial markets, uh, or at least the quite healthy ones for some time. For example, in Germany, there have been negative yields up to God, I think it was around like 2 to 5 years for a number of years on their yield curve. The Euribor curve has seen negative rates up to even like the 5-year point on the swap curve. It's and I think a lot of people, in some ways, there's been a sort of fear of a bubble in sovereign bonds for a number of years. And I'm quite honestly surprised that it's lasted this long. Asset managers in Europe are absolutely killing themselves to find any kinds of return. And it's, I mean, I think that when you get to this point, you get pretty dangerously close to liquidity trap scenarios. It's I don't know. It's going to be very interesting. I think the next couple of years in the European economy, we're starting to see maybe a bit of good news, because we're starting to see some of the economies that were struggling with their sovereign debt burden start to climb out of it a little bit. Portugal, for example. And maybe at some point we'll start to see a real demand rise in credit markets and start to see interest rates pop up a bit. But it's, I mean, when overnight curves and interbank curves go to negative points up to about 5 years, as they've been in Europe for some time, it's just, you're absolutely destroying returns for productive capital investments. And I just don't see how this story is going to end in any other way than the popping of a significant asset bubble.
That's rather worrying stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, what makes it the story really quite, I mean, so within the Eurozone, each of the individual countries, of course, don't have control over their monetary policies. So they don't have the situation that the US and the UK have in basically being able to monetize their debt. So liquidity crunches for the governments. I mean, this is something that posts real credit risk in sovereign bond markets here, which we were seeing for a number of years in the PIGS countries, and we continue to see with Greece. I think, I mean, the European Central Bank, they've taken a few steps to stabilize the situation, because they've started a bond purchasing facility a few years ago. So it sort of kept things at least kind of calm for a while. But yeah, I mean, at some point, economies here are really going to have to start kicking.
Well, at some point they gotta face a rude awakening. Man, this is rather scary stuff, what you're saying. Well, Well, I think it's basically government. Well, not really government, but basically your responsibility, to be honest.
Well, I mean, it's just we've had just a very poorly constructed um, regime of fiscal and monetary policy for decades, and I mean, it's nothing that we can't really get ourselves out of um, with some pretty sensible reforms. Uh, but I think that we're getting to a point where these reforms are going to have to come pretty quickly, or we're going to have to get on this path quite quickly. I mean, in particular, my advocacy for changing the tax system to land value taxation. Um, I mean, the sort of natural developments in economies, in the developed economies, um, that are setting the trajectory of land values on an ever increasing course that will start absorbing a greater percentage of wealth distributions around the world. We're going to have to start getting on track of this pretty quickly, especially as we're going through a period of the next couple of decades, it looks like, with technological transformations and quite a lot of automation of production that's going to send the demand for land uh, way through the roof. And also as we continue to expand global trade. Um, so this is something, and we're already seeing this in a number of countries where we have pretty good data. The UK is probably the best example. Land values have risen, I think, something like 20 percentage points in the last couple of decades in terms of share of net worth in the UK. It's now over 50%. We're seeing similar patterns in other Northern European countries like France, and, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, even in countries like Canada and Australia, where we have pretty decent data. Which, I mean, that's quite significant what's happening in those countries, given how it's not necessary that both countries are pretty low population density countries, although you tend to see the population clustering in major urban areas. But this is something that a reform that's going to need to be made pretty quickly. And I mean, even doing something as subtle as this will start to correct a lot of the sort of discontents of how financial markets have been engineered over decades. We'll start to see greater incentives for investment in productive enterprises, especially as more land is opened up for productive investment, productive activity. With greater incomes, we'll also start to see more incentives for housing investments with greater returns accruing to them. So it's something that we're going to have to get on top of pretty quickly. Even a country like Taiwan, which has had quite a limited application of these ideas for some time, they're even starting to run into a greater problem with land values there as well. So it's something that's global, and I feel like it's going to become more of a topic in quite a few countries going forward. Which, I mean, to me, it's like it's great that it's going to provide a platform for these ideas going forward, which I feel are quite necessary. But it's also comes with quite a risk of what we could be experiencing over the next 10 years or so.
So, is politicians in Germany or in the EU are aware of this, or they're distracted by rather trivial things right now?
Well, I mean, the main topic is Brexit, of course.
Wait, they're still talking about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are negotiations going on with the UK over the terms of their relationship with the EU after Brexit.
Oh,
And of course, some people wanting to stick it to the UK.
well, they got every right to leave. I don't see why this is such a big problem. Like the EU is not going to miss out on anything if the UK leaves. Like
Yeah,
they can still trade with one another. Like, come on, like they're so close to one another.
well, some people just want to get something out of it for sure. And like they think that they've got the UK in a compromised position, given that they're cutting off or the possibility of access to the single market being cut off. I don't know. I mean, in the end, something will get done, and it will be. Yeah,
So,
it doesn't make any sense for Britain to not be linked quite tightly in some way to the single market. I mean, I think that Britain, and I don't think that Britain should, put itself in a position where its ability to negotiate free trade agreements with other countries is compromised. But yeah, it's these geopolitical arrangements. It's always some show going on.
oh, so complicated and beautiful theater to just learn about. To be honest.
Yeah. But no, I mean, really, the only country in Europe right now where there's been a serious discussion about land values is in the UK, and that's because the situation there has become so pronounced that, I mean, it's really sort of forced its way, even to the limited extent that it has, into the public dialogue. I mean, even now, like, one of the kicks I sort of get out of this is that The Guardian, which is quite, a left wing publication, is getting behind the idea of it. I mean, they definitely aren't taking the position that I'm taking, which is that it should replace basically the entire tax system, along with taxes based on a similar concept. And I mean, they don't really understand the real economic rationale for it, and the power that it has to correct some problems. It's like basically they're just making the typical leftist argument about the privilege of wealth and so on and so forth, and see it as a redistributionary kind of
Hey, they're leftist, man.
mechanism. Yeah.
Lucky.
Well, but like I will give them their due. I mean, they are talking about a policy that is, quite a necessary reform, and definitely one that I want to see. I just wish that they would sort of dig a little bit deeper into the topic and start to see that, okay, this is something that's actually going to address most of what they want to have addressed,
So,
in terms of leading to a society with, let's say, a more equal distribution of wealth, but done so within a framework of free market capitalism. I mean, it basically it addresses um, the the inequalities that develop, but that develop in quite an unnatural way, not in a way that just sort of is necessarily a consequence of the operation of an organic market.
So, on taxes, do you have like any specific criticism of the flat income tax as Rand Paul supports? Like,
Well, I mean, my first criticism would be it's an income tax, which I oppose in principle, and also on utilitarian grounds. Income taxes end up penalizing uh, productive effort, productive enterprise. It ends up creating deadweight loss uh, from from market exchanges, and in that sense, it also even ends up making the public services that the income tax ends up paying for more expensive to the economy, given the deadweight loss that's created by income taxation. And this is the main criticism that those of us who are calling for a land value tax would make of pretty much most of the forms of taxation that are heavily relied upon in most developed economies, be it income taxation, consumption taxation, um, profit taxation, so on and so forth. I mean, what you want to do if you want to fund some public services is you want to have a tax that's not going to create deadweight loss. And this is, I mean, this is sort of the very special quality about a land value tax, because land is each plot of land is a perfectly inelastic good with no marginal cost of production. So therefore, there's no changes to incentives of the landlord with respect to how much land to offer for rent or for sale. And therefore, a tax on land rent can capture essentially landlord surplus without causing a loss in or causing rents to go up, or causing a loss in surplus to the renter or the purchaser of land. So it ends up essentially, it also doesn't end up penalizing production, because marginal costs of production for produced goods isn't affected. A land value tax would essentially just be a fixed cost. So it's essentially a way of collecting whatever revenue is necessary without penalizing production and without penalizing the market for it. Whereas the approach that someone like Rand Paul wants to take is, I mean, it's still penalizing productive effort to pay for what we deem the government should be paying for. And it's not efficient in that sense. And I would also argue that that income taxes in general are theft, because you end up forcibly taking the product of someone's labor or capital that they have put to productive use.
just the plays devil advocates. Do you think this is like a more realistic take to simplify the tax code to the support Rand Paul flat tax plan, wherever? Like, that's a good step forward.
Yeah, because I mean, we need to move. We need to move in the direction of taxing land value. I mean, if you were to tell me, okay, let's have sort of a compromise situation where um, we end up we start taxing land value at a certain rate, and we end up, let's say, reducing income taxes and changing the structure and cleaning up the code and everything. Um, and we sort of had a sort of transition plan where over time um, the land value rate would go up while the income tax rate would go down. I mean, I'm certainly open to that. Um, but we really need to move in that direction. I feel like with tax policy in general.
Mhm. And maybe I should read a book by Henry George at some point in my life. But
Read Progress and Poverty, like as soon as you can, I would say. I think it's something you would find really interesting. And this was something that I read, let's say, toward the end of my undergrad studies in college, and it was really quite eye opening for me. I think you would be um, I think you'd be impressed.
hmm, I know Rothbard praise him or use him as a basis for free trade and power of the market. So
Yeah, I mean, Rothbard also wasn't a very big fan of views on land value taxation, but
hey, he's
uh,
an anarchist. So
yeah, sure. Um, but I mean, that's Henry George is definitely. I mean, he's one of the most powerful voices in favor of free trade in the history of economic thought, and
well, Bastiat, from these kind of big in free
yeah,
trade.
yeah, sure.
Well, he was
Um,
more funny. I think he's funny. Is Henry George funny, Miss Bastiat?
um, I don't know. I mean, he's like, I think there were a few lines in Progress and Poverty. Um, it's not as, like, let's say, as overtly funny, but I mean, there's definitely some sort of, and I mean, it's he can be maybe a little bit long-winded in um, some of the comments that he makes, with maybe a bit of irony um, or something like that, or where he's pointing out like how um, he can be a bit rude um, to about certain ideas that he's arguing against, which can be, I mean, sometimes I would get some kicks out of that when I would read. Um,
Hey,
but
come on. There's something funny about making fun of protectionists and accusing them about blocking out the sun. There's something funny about that.
you know, yeah. I mean, Bastiat's a great writer for sure.
Just, uh, even with Rothbard, he has a very sarcastic sense of humor in his writings.
Yeah, I mean, he was, well,
I
he
know
was
I know you don't
respected.
like Rothbard that much, but hey, he's kind of important though.
Yeah, I mean, he has his place. Um, I mean, I think that he made some decisions in his life that I really don't agree with, and I think that he's wrong about some things and um, some of his stances, but um, no, I mean, there's no doubt that he was a major contributor to libertarian thought, and I respect that.
Yeah. everybody got their own faults, but like if you see like people like Tom Woods and other people that just know him in his life, like they just love the man, like they really love the man so much, including Ron Paul.
Well, I mean, he's quite a charming guy, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I mean that always goes a long way. And um, I mean, I feel like that there are probably some people who were students of his who, um, because I mean, he can make quite a powerful presentation. Um, who definitely um, are just completely taken in with the guy. I mean, look at his fans who aren't Thomas Woods and Ron Paul. Um, he's got as enthusiastic of a backing as basically any intellectual figure.
Yeah. Plus, actually, in general, like in besides libertarianism, how big of a presence that Rothbard had in economics as in the field?
Well, I mean, not much in mainstream economics. I mean,
Oh,
most people think he's kind of a crank. Um, but
that's rather disappointing, but that's kind of his own fault.
well, I mean, it's like I think mainstream economics doesn't really, yeah, if you're outside of the bounds of neoclassical synthesis, then I mean, there's not generally much of a place for you in the academia of economics.
Well,
Or
Hayek,
unless like you're really into, well, no, I wouldn't say that. I mean, game theory has been quite popular for quite a long time in academic research. Um, behavioral economics is also uh, becoming a hotter topic.
mm,
Um, but I mean, it's yeah. Aside from that, it's um, unless you have like, a history of economic thought course, um, which actually um, my um, school where I did my undergrad did have. Um, maybe in that course you get a little bit of exposure to Austrian uh, theory or something like that. But aside from that, it's
just I don't know. Like, I think I think Austrians I think Austrian got their right place in history. You know.
no, of course they do, and I mean they also I mean they have contributed to, or at least the earliest Austrians contributed quite heavily to mainstream economic thought. I mean the idea of marginalism is very much a cornerstone um, of microeconomics now. I mean, it's definitely it's been applied in a more sort of technical, um, mathematized framework um, through neoclassical sort of modeling, which I mean, I think has some value. Um, I mean, it's nothing that to basically plan an economy on, but from an analytical perspective, there's definitely some understanding that it provides. Um, but I mean, Carl Menger in particular is one of the very most important economists. Um,
And
and
Hayek,
sorry,
and Hayek, no, Mager. It just seemed like Mager and Hayek get mostly talked about, and maybe does Bumbark. Am I saying his name right? Does Bumbark talk about in economics discourse?
yeah, Bohm von Bavak is, I mean, that's how it would be pronounced in German. Um, I mean, he's not like, I'm only going on my experience. and it's not a name that's brought up, but um, I mean, the topics that he deals with, which are largely the same topics that Menger does. It's, I mean, you definitely get it in a microeconomics course,
Yeah.
with the emphasis on marginal analysis.
Yeah. Also, speaking of economics, yeah, didn't you say that Karl Marx was like a big enemy of Henry George? No, or
Yeah, he wasn't a fan. Um, I mean, he wrote a letter that I mean, it's quite famous. He was writing it to some other intellectual and talking about the book and like calling him backward, and I mean, just really being quite childish, to tell you the truth, and not really making much of a substantive argument.
hey,
And
actually, yeah, a dwarf economist.
uh, but like, and like he made like this one point, like, oh well, in the US, like there's so much land available, and yet there's quite a lot of inequality in the US. Where I mean, he doesn't really get into um, the arguments that George brings up about the importance of land in determining wealth distributions based on um, people congregating in communities. I mean, when you're in a sort of lower income quantile or lower wealth quantile, um, and you're not able to access the opportunities where you're at, which is most likely in, um, or in most cases, let's say since the advent of the industrial depression to an increasing degree in major urban areas. If you're not able to access the valuable opportunities in land um, in these communities to create wealth with, um, I mean, for one, your bargaining power over any wages that you get in a market is going to be incredibly low. So, I mean, you're not able to take advantage of all of the theoretically available land um, that could be out there. I mean, it was a terrible argument that he was making in the letter. And it was just simply a one-line rhetorical question, like not taking it seriously at all. Um, I
Wait,
mean, Marx, like I've I've read some of um, his work, and I want to read more. I've actually got volume 3 of Capital on my list because this is the one when he like really um, he gets quite technical, and I mean he actually talks about um, land rent in this, though he mostly discusses it in the context of agricultural land. Um, I mean, he only has like one very short chapter on um, land rents from buildings and so on and so forth. And I mean, I have read that one, and it's not. He sort of hits on some points, but at the same time, just given the brief attention he pays to it, he doesn't really understand the importance of that. I feel like, whereas that was quite a major part of Henry George's analysis, um, probably even the most important part of his analysis. And I mean, the idea of land rents going up as communities build, um, and as commerce advances, and we end up with sort of concentrations of economic activities and locations. Just the pure location rent, um, aside from, say, rent for agricultural lands that would be based on um, yields. It's really the former that's the problem in the long run. And I feel like that, based on my understanding of Marx's treatment of rent, I mean, he does see it as a problem, uh, but he misses how big of a problem it really is. And um, I mean, it leads him in the end, I feel like, to uh, really miss in addition to having quite a poor um, theoretical framework in some ways. For example, labor theory of value.
Yeah.
I think that these two things in particular, I mean, really lead him to miss the point and to miss the cause of a lot of his uh, complaints about capitalism.
Do you think he just started in the middle? That's one of Thomas Sowell's criticism of Marx is that he felt like Marx started in the middle of his analysis and just went from there.
Um, well, like, from my understanding, I mean, there's because quite a lot of Marx's work was published posthumously. I mean, Capital 3 was published, Volume 3 was published posthumously. I believe Volume 2 was as well. I'm not totally sure about that. But like Volume 3 in particular, basically, it's largely a bunch of notes that were sort of cobbled together, that he had put out after his death. And where, I mean, he had ideas that weren't like very well, like, or weren't completely thought out, and weren't completely specified. Um, and so
It makes you wonder if Engels wrote
it feels like, and there are things that, like, every once in a while he'll say something and just say, okay, this is the way it is, but like doesn't go into any real elaboration behind it, just sort of takes it on faith.
I don't think so. Well, from my understanding, like Marx sort of view a basically in the 3 volumes of Das of Capital is like he just basically used a dialectical extraction, like he like like maybe that's one of the reasons why he doesn't just explain things because he's not really trying to prove anything. He's trying to say, "Hey, this is how things are under under a this extraction, essentially." You know,
Yeah, I mean, I get, like, as I said, okay, I can see where you're coming from there, but um, it's, yeah, I still feel like that there's a lot to be desired in, from what I've seen from his argumentation, especially. I mean, I feel like he's he often gets the criticism of being a very unclear writer, and I definitely think that's true.
hey, oh, well, like if you read like other like they often say that Engel's like a much clearer and more elegant writer than Marx. I think you're better off just reading Engels, to be honest.
Okay, I haven't read Engels.
Oh, I feel like Engels are. I think Engels get like too ignored in the Marxist community. Like even like I've spoken to Marxists before, and they all like some Marxists before, and they all say that Marx was really is a bad writer.
Well, I think also, like, and um I think that's something that is probably at play here also is quite a lot of, I mean, his work has been translated from German to English, and that can be, I mean, um,
Actually, I thought he wrote Das Kapital in English.
sorry?
I thought he wrote Das Kapital in English.
Well,
For
but like a lot of other work, um, and it's, and actually, I'm not totally sure about that. I'm pretty sure that Das Kapital was German. I mean, titled, yeah. And that it's been translated.
just
But
that.
like, it's
um,
like German can be because it's um
that's not really a good excuse for bad writing. Like, you know.
nah, but like in German, the thing is, I haven't read it in German, but like it's one of these things where, um, I mean, German has like some words for things for which there aren't necessarily words in English, and there's like the German language has a very sort of formulaic structure in terms of grammar and um, sentence formulation and so on and so forth. And you'll see translators who translate German to English who will be sort of like thinking in German while writing out in English. And you get sort of you get sentences that like are just very odd at times. And um, I mean, you really only sort of there can be at times in which you really only sort of get what they're trying to say if you've got a background in German language, because then you can really sort of trace the thought pattern behind the expression behind it. Um, and I mean that's a problem when just generally when people are translating works across languages.
So, how's Marx's views in economics orthodoxy? Like, is he like ignored or?
Yeah, I mean, in let's say mainstream academic economics, yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's um, again maybe in history of thought course you get a little bit of exposure to Marx. Like, I mean, I had a little bit of exposure to Marx in history of thought course, but in academic economics, again, if you're
Well,
outside if you're outside of the sort of neoclassical synthesis bubble, or you know the more like technical game theory econometrics, um, you know or like behavioral research, things like that, um, you're not going to get much traction generally.
well, well,
Unless you're in France, where, for example, Thomas Piketty is quite. I mean, he has quite some traction. There's some momentum behind more like, let's say, um, left Keynesian uh, fusion in economics.
yeah.
Um,
Oh, what's your thoughts on praxeology? Um,
well, I mean, I think that the idea that I think it's idea of how to formulate um, sort of analysis and um, ideas about how people behave within markets, and um, how ultimately markets will end up behaving. I mean, I think it's a good, it's whenever you're forming um, theories, you have to end up making having this sort of thought process, and ultimately you're going to have some sort of assumptions built into that. I mean, that's just sort of inevitable. So I mean, I think it's definitely quite correct, or it sort of makes a good point in that sense. But where I really part with, let's say, like the more Mises enthusiastic side of the Austrian school, is on this insistence of sort of extending praxeology throughout the entire process of analysis and argumentation, to the point of, I mean, they end up dismissing empirical analysis. It's kind of weird because they'll also reference historical economic phenomena and events when constructing their arguments, but then like, they're very dismissive of empirical research, of econometrics as or mathematical modeling as having any real value. And I mean, that's one where, quite honestly, I really part with that crowd, because I mean, it's not. I'll freely acknowledge, because I mean, this is really my sort of academic field now. I'm doing my PhD in financial mathematics. So mathematical modeling is really my world. And I will freely concede that, I mean, there are real issues with using this to ascertain absolute truths. I mean, with any kind of complex sort of, or any type of variable that you're trying to model, which has quite complex dynamics and any number of factors driving its evolution over time, it's going to be nearly impossible to arrive at a mathematical model that's going to perfectly predict its evolution and capture probability distributions of its evolution, or that's going to have 100% correct predictive power. I mean, that's just impossible. I'll concede that. I mean, it's hard enough in my area, which is essentially in derivatives modeling, where I'm trying to model the stochastic dynamics of financial instruments. But I mean, for a macroeconomy, it's quite hopeless to be able to be 100% correct. That said, I feel like that it's quite useful for, I mean, you can get some information using these techniques that will at least give you some insight. It's not going to be good enough insight for, let's say, purposes of planning an economy, or give you like some type of sort of target for what interest rate should be, or something along those lines, or let's say what kind of moves that you should make to manage liquidity in the market. But it's going to tell you something about what's going on in the economy that improves our understanding in some way.
Yeah. Also, you seem like you have like a rather bad experience with the more Miesian branch of the Austrian school.
I mean, I'm not going to generalize. I'm not going to.
Actually,
I haven't had like just an avalanche of horrible experiences with them. I mean, I've had a couple of arguments on Twitter with some of these guys, with a couple of them at least. Like, and I mean, the one that really got to me was I posted an article from the 1990s from this economist Fred Fulveri, who's both a Georgist and an Austrian, who was he wrote this great article in the 90s about Geo-Austrian synthesis, basically combining the elements of Austrian business cycle theory analysis with the analysis of land rent, in using both to explain business cycles. And it's quite an interesting article. I can pass it along to you if you want.
Yeah, do that.
Yeah. And actually, in this, he found that over time, throughout history, there tend to be around 18-year cycles in which land values escalate and construction activity escalates. And then after within a very short time after the escalation of land prices corrects, reverses, we tend to see a recession in 1 to 2 years or so. And it's actually, in the article, it presents all this data. And I mean, it's not the most sophisticated empirical analysis, but at the same time, it's just the raw data itself. I mean, you can see quite an interesting trend there that seems to have a lot of explanatory power. But anyway, I posted this, and there was this one guy on Twitter who's, I mean, he's definitely an ANCAP, more Rothbardian type, who came at me and who started this argument about whether or not Folgeri should be considered an Austrian. And I mean, his whole argument was, well, I mean, he violates the tenets of praxeology because he's referring to empirical data to validate his conclusions. I mean, I'm just like, it doesn't matter how faithfully he's adhering to sort of Austrian business cycle theory analysis, or really fundamental concepts of Austrian analysis about economic sort of framing economic phenomena. None of that really mattered to him. It was just like, oh well, he resorted to empiricism. He wasn't a good enough praxeologist, so take away his Austrian card. And I mean, I've seen that those sorts of arguments being made at times, and I don't know. I think it's kind of silly, to be honest.
Oh man, praxeology versus maybe if Mises embraced operationalism like Hayek did, maybe be more mainstream.
Wait, what?
Wait, what?
What did you say?
I said maybe Mises embrace operationalism like Hayek did, maybe be a bit more mainstream.
Oh yeah, I mean, you said operationalism, right?
Yeah, operationalism.
Oh, okay. I was like, I actually thought you said they're upper racialism, and I'm like, what?
I can't pronounce things at all.
No, it's no problem. I mean, that's we're all good now.
Yeah, just operationalism versus praxeology. Who will win, the a priori method or the positive method? Yeah, Hayek. Just, I think honestly, I think Hayek is really underrated when it comes to economics. Like he's just mostly known for the role of serfdom and the constitutions of liberty, but people just don't talk about the pure theory of capital or the um other stuff he did. Price.
Well, I don't think that he's not recognized for his work. I mean, he's a Nobel laureate.
Yeah, just I just feel like people just often jump to the role to serfdom, but never read the prices in productions or the denationalization of money or
Well, I don't think that most people are really all that interested in, let's say, the hardcore theory. I think that most people are interested in the sort of more philosophical ideas and the I guess the more direct politically applicable side of things. I don't think that most people really want to dig in the weeds of quite technical.
well, considering that the pure theory of capital, like one is probably going to be like one of the hardest books that people will ever read in their lives.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, it's the same thing with Milton Friedman. Like nobody really ever talks about theory of the consumption function, or any of the work that he did in that area. Even though, I mean, quite honestly, his work in consumer theory is probably some of his most important work. But people, I mean, they want to discuss free to choose capital, capitalism and freedom, and they want to go back to some of his popcorn content.
I think the same thing though was Thomas Sowell as well. Like you ever see people talk about his book Say's Law, and his contributions to price theory.
Yeah.
Just like the thing is, like I've been around their communities. They don't really have they have a very negative opinion on Thomas Sowell. Like they just view him as other libertarian or conservative. But if you actually just read this stuff, like, come on, this man is kind of like a genius in his own right.
Yeah, I mean, but yeah, I really haven't had much Soul, but just snippets. But I mean, I will say he's a very good writer. He's very clear, and he's able to explain things quite well.
Hey, if he can explain the Hegelian dialectic in clear language, so yeah, he gets some high bonus points.
Oh, okay.
Actually, I think a good book to start with Soul is probably Intellectuals in Society. To be honest,
Okay.
That's I think that's like one of his best books he ever wrote.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I probably should, just because Soul is starting to come up so much nowadays. I should probably get into something pretty soon. But oh man, the thing is, I've got so much other reading I need to do right now. Quite technical material for my research and so on. Wealth, poverty, and politics. Okay.
Get this, it's Again, about $35.
Okay. Well, I've got some gift certificate money saved up on my my Apple account, so
Yeah, good read, very good read.
yeah, I'd like something that's maybe a bit um, well, I don't want to say lighter, and I don't want to demean soul in any way, but something that's maybe
Hey,
something that can get some stochastic differential equations out of my head for a while.
well, well, the best part is he doesn't talk about graphs or mathematical equations. He's very commonsensical in the book.
Yeah.
Well, that's yeah. Actually, I think that's like one of his biggest strong points and weakness because he's really commonsensical in his writings.
Yeah. Well, I
Like,
mean, it's why he's popular.
yeah, just that's like I see that how people use that against him. You know,
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like I can see that line of criticism. I mean, economics has become quite an empirical field. Um, so I think that there are a lot of economists who sort of sneer at work that's not, let's say, the most technically sophisticated. And I think that's a mistake. Um, I think that someone like Soul serves quite a valuable purpose. Um, and I think, I mean, he's really like he's going into um, or he's trying to explain, like, let's say, fundamental concepts in economics in an accessible way. And I mean, I don't think that he's like he's not really even trying to like construct um, sort of unassailable proofs about certain things, formalistic proofs or anything. Um, and I mean, I think that's fine. Like it's he provides a service in some way, and um, I mean that's like I'm sure that there's things or conclusions that he comes to that can certainly be challenged, but um, I mean, not everybody um, has to publish a paper that ends up landing them a Nobel laureate.
mm. Well,
Um,
he kind of deserved like a Nobel Prize, like you know, like it just feels like so first like Soul won't be a Nobel Prize for his work and come to his contributions to economic history and the social and sociology and other things.
no, I mean you know he's earned his place in the dialogue for sure. Um, but I don't know. I mean, I don't think that I don't he hasn't contributed, I think, to theory um, in ways that you tend to see um, people be highly recognized for. I mean, like somebody like John Nash, for example, in his introduction of game theory. I mean, that basically like created a whole new field within economics. Um, And I mean, it's, yeah, because economics has trended toward becoming more and more of, let's say, a scientific field. You know, you kind of need to cross that barrier to get that kind of recognition. But at the same time, I mean, people like Soul, who are out there to teach, essentially, they have their own role to play. And I don't think that Thomas Sowell would really complain about his career. I mean,
Well, actually, I think he's very satisfied everything he's done with his life, like given his attitude and demeanor.
yeah, and like I mean, there are plenty of economists or academic economists who aren't the most profound researchers in the world, or the most profound contributors to theory, who just by being a really good lecturer or a really good teacher, being able to communicate the ideas to students, end up doing really, really well. I mean, I had one professor when I went to UNC, um, by the name of Ralph Burns. I mean, he wasn't like a big um, contributor to economic theory, or I mean, he never published a paper that was highly cited, and um, or like one of the most sort of referenced works in the research field. But I mean, he was an amazing lecturer. He was able to get students, I mean, even at introductory level courses, um, who weren't going to be economics majors. I mean, he was able to engage them in the subject, and communicate ideas very well. He wrote a couple of textbooks, one intro level textbook and another micro textbook, that both sold incredibly well. It's interesting. His co-author was Gerald Stone, who is the father of Matt Stone,
Hmm.
one of the South Park creators. And he actually, I mean, he's got some interesting stories to tell about that. But I mean, yeah, like Ralph Burns, he wasn't, he wasn't one of the most acclaimed contributors to the field, but he, he definitely contributed a lot in terms of um, and people like him as well contributed a lot um, to to economics gaining a lot more traction and interest. And even somebody, for example, Stephen Dubner and Stephen Levitt, when they wrote Freakonomics, that book in particular, like, I mean, there were no like amazing um, theoretical revelations by this. They were just simply showing how applying um, sort of concepts in economic analysis and applying econometrics to sort of fields that are outside the traditional realm of economics, how much power that can have in explaining human behavior. Um, and I mean, just, they posted a few econometric findings to support their claims. It was a very well argued book, and I would say that that book in the middle of the last decade really drove a lot of people into becoming more interested in economics.
Yeah. Also, on the internet drama, how you, what's your thoughts with Sargon of Akkad and the alt right recently? You know.
Oh God, I really don't pay much attention to that. Um, like, I I saw some of it for a while. I mean, I saw that debate with Richard Spencer. Um, I mean, you know, like it's just all like, just it's all bullshit basically. Like I think Um, yeah, I'm definitely not sympathetic to the alt-right at all. And I would definitely say I'm more sympathetic to Sargon in terms of views. I mean, Sargon's not the best debater in the world. Probably not the most. Um, yeah, he's.
But
I wouldn't say he's like the most substantial theoretical contributor, if you will, or like empirical contributor. I think he does valuable work, and I think that he is a smart guy. But like he's not necessarily um, coming at this with all the tools um, in the shed. But like the way that the alt right acts is just I can definitely like I can definitely understand Sargon's frustration. Um, because I've gotten into discussions with a couple of them at times, and I mean I'm not going to name names, but I'm not very impressed with my interactions with them. I mean, um, and I don't want to generalize because I don't know everyone on it, aside from me disagreeing with them, but like just the few interactions I've had with a couple of people, it, they it was just really obnoxious. That I was dealing with, just incredibly, um, just disproportionately aggressive, focusing on ad hominems, um, and just like I can really sort of see where Sargon is coming from and believe him when he says something like, "Yeah, this is just a complete waste of time. Like, I don't want to have discussions like this. I want to be real about things." Um, and so I can sort of see where he's coming from there. And again, like I don't want to say that that necessarily applies to everyone on the alt right. I mean, there could be a couple of people who are reasonable. I don't know. Um, I mean, quite honestly, I'm not really interested in them. Aside from disagreeing with their point of view. Um, but yeah, like I mean, all that drama stuff that's been going on in these communities for, I guess, a couple of years now or something. I don't really have much motivation for that. Um, like it's all noise basically. I mean, I guess like this whole blood sport phenomena that's developed. Um, yeah, maybe you can get some kicks out of that, but um, just for the pure blood sport and entertainment. But it's just like I'm not really interested in it in terms of the discussions that I'd like to have.
mm, I can understand. Just just that I don't know. I think the way Sargon or Carl, whatever he wants to be called, I think he just handled himself poorly when it comes to the alt right. And on the alt right, like that's sort of like kind of their shtick, like they're kind of like trolls in the sense. Like
Yeah, definitely.
like they always been like that. They've been trolls, like just to screw with people around, like you know. But like if they get serious, like you be like rather impressed with their intelligence and insights about society.
No, I mean, I think that there are probably some people. I mean, I definitely think there are people on the alt right who are very smart people. Um, I mean, the biggest mistake you can make about people like the alt right is that they're all idiots. Um, no matter how awful you find their views to be. Um, and it's a mistake that people have made with um, these sorts of extremist groups on both the left and the right for quite a long time in history. Um, But like, the trolling stuff, well, that's how all these extremist groups try to build their movement, basically. I mean, people on the left are doing that too. Um, the it's like, it's really kind of inevitable for political movements that are outside of the mainstream, that are quite radical um, and are trying to gain traction. So it's got quite a, I think it's got quite a tint of having read Saul Alinsky behind it. Um, and I know that actually within, because I've had an idea of these sort of circles that have developed into the alt-right for some time. I mean, this is something that has been, I think, sort of in the works for about a decade. Um, looking at the history of some of the key players like Richard Spencer.
Who is an idiot, in my opinion.
I mean, he's got an academic background that's definitely impressive, but I mean, he'll make arguments that are maybe not very impressive at times, and he comes off as very smarmy at times and quite arrogant and all that, and it's his shtick. But like, I mean, he's somebody who he approaches things in debates and dialogue in quite with quite a strong focus on coming across as like very forceful and authoritative and trying to establish power. That's why sometimes, like at points during that debate with Sargon, he went at him quite aggressively. He's someone who I think has some education in sort of in rhetoric. He's someone who's got a background in the humanities. He's got quite a lot of affinity for Nietzsche, for example. And I mean, it really comes across in the way that he talks about his views and talks about the world, and talks about like building the alt-right and everything. I mean, he's one of these guys who like he'll make superficial arguments at times, but he'll do it in quite in quite a forceful way, and to someone who's not really picking it apart critically, who can be sort of persuaded by the rather forceful presentation. I mean, it's something that works, and I mean, it's a rhetorical strategy that works with a lot of people. So it's yeah. I mean, there are lots of things that Richard Spencer has said that I find, to be either objectionable or just downright superficial or not well constructed. But I mean, he has. I mean, he's able to persuade people.
Well, I don't think he can persuade us into socialism.
Well, no, and I mean, he's not going to be able. I think he's going to fail massively in trying to persuade whites to become more collectivists and push for an ethno state. I mean, I feel like that. I really feel like that most people, like just your average person in society, regardless of race, has gotten to a point where their main concerns in life are their own material well-being and that of their family. I mean, even like people who are on, let's say, like the IDPOL left, quite a lot of them, um, not all of them are really, let's say, socialist. A lot of them are thinking within the framework of capitalism, but wanting to open up opportunities for minority groups um, to participate. And it's so that it's not so much an emphasis, let's say, on wanting to totally reorganize society along racially collectivist lines. It's just an idea of sort of building on the framework here. Now, I definitely don't agree with concepts like um, quota hiring and stuff like that, um, but or quota emissions. But I mean, at the same time, I can see where quite a big segment of the people who are arguing for these things are coming at this from, let's say, more of an opportunity standpoint, um, or at least a viewpoint that's compatible with that idea, um, rather than wanting to start some sort of tribal war necessarily. I mean, there are definitely activists who are quite extreme on both sides who are looking for that, but I feel like that it's really a case more of them investing the energy in being agitators for these ideas rather than it being something that voting populi of most major countries really have any sort of inclination toward nowadays. I mean, most people, I think, would just say if a politician came to them today um, and asked them, okay, what do you want me to address? They would say, economy's stupid. I mean, the old Bill Clinton line, it's the economy's stupid. And I mean, one thing that you can say about the 1990s is the economy was doing particularly well um, because of certain developments that sort of occurred with the advent of um, information technology
Mm.
and
Uh,
also the expansion of global trade. And at that point, I mean, during the 90s, we weren't seeing this sort of focus on identity politics because, I mean, we were seeing an economic expansion and with quite a lot of people participating in it. Um, the
I
problem is that in certain sectors that ended up um, losing out due to outsourcing of production. Um, I mean, this has had an impact in certain communities, and um, I mean, there hasn't been, really any sort of policy response to this, um, to opening up opportunities for those communities to get back on track, and to participate in the expanded marketplace that we have. Um, and I mean that's something that you could end up seeing, or something that's been festering for a while. That's probably made um, certain communities a bit more susceptible to identity politics. But I mean, really, throughout history, that tends to be the trend, anyways. Like for example, one of the probably one of the biggest examples of a societal breakdown along demographic lines within a country over the past 3 decades was the breakdown of Yugoslavia after the death of Tito. Um, I mean, it was a country that was basically putting together um, a bunch of different countries with different ethnic, religious backgrounds, um, but nonetheless with quite a lot of common cultural heritage, common language, so on and so forth. And for 40 years under Tito, and this is actually, it's quite a fascinating example of socialism that was implemented. I mean, it was really more of a market socialist system with quite a lot of participation of worker-owned cooperatives in the economy, quite decentralized. And I mean, they benefited from a lot of loans that were in financial assistance that was provided by the United States, because Yugoslavia left the Soviet bloc and they were seen as sort of like the good communists in the world, if you will. And for a number of years, combining these two elements, getting the financial infusion from the West, the standard of living in Yugoslavia was quite high for some decades. But then once Tito died, and around that time, the debt burdens that had built up in Yugoslavia started to become due, and creditors were getting antsy. That's when the economy really started to take a turn for the worse. And I mean, during the time when Yugoslavia was doing relatively well, the tensions among the ethnic groups, and there were, among, especially between Serbs and Croats, but also Bosnian Muslims. There's historically quite some tension in that region, but for under Tito's rule, there was actually quite a bit of multi-ethnic harmony. It was, enforced with quite a brutal hand by Tito, who crushed any sort of rising of nationalist sentiment. But nonetheless, while the economy, or while the economic standard of living was relatively high there, this sort of sectarian sentiments really took a back seat and quite died down. Like, for example, Bosnia, which is the most multi-ethnic of them, of all the Yugoslavia countries, ex-Yugoslavia countries. There was actually quite a high rate of intermarriage among the different religious populations. For example, intermarriages between Bosnian Muslims and Serbian Orthodox people. So it kind of worked for a while the economy was doing well, but then once the economy went to hell, that's when the sort of nationalist sentiments started getting traction, the sectarian sentiments. That's when the memories of the sectarian conflicts of World War II started being a bit more fresh in people's minds. And that's ultimately what led to the downfall of the country. So, I mean, I think in the end, we've gotten to a point where people just, they're really interested in their own economic well-being, and I don't think that as long as that's being taken care of, that the id-Pol trends are going to end up winning out. Sorry, I just rambled for quite a while there.
It's fine. Just I don't know. Just what must be done though. So
sorry.
I'm sorry. Just thinking out loud.
Fair enough.
So just I think I gotta end the broadcast here.
Yeah.
Mm.
Nothing.
Yeah, it was a nice conversation.
Yeah, likewise. We should do this more often. I mean, it's good to have these sort of informal chats, I feel like.
Yeah. Okay, shout yourself out, George.
Yeah, so you guys, you can find me on Twitter at Geolibertarian George. And I have less time these days to do my Twitter trolling and arguments and discussions, but I mean, if you send something at me, I'm probably going to end up responding. So
Yeah. This is your host, Frederick Voltaire Bassiette, a random black guy on there, and then I hope you have a good weekend, good Friday. Peace out.